they're always a thorn in everyone's side, and that is the Tennessee Titans. They ended last year at 7-10. They were in the conversation to make the playoffs last year, going into like the last 2 weeks, and it got to the point where they had to throw out Josh Dobbs after they just signed him, basically. So, not obviously Tennessee's best year, but they didn't have much to go with after trading A.J. Brown, as we saw, and quarterback health was an issue. But nonetheless, departure-wise, they did lose a bunch of pieces, starting with the offensive line, lost center Ben Jones, and then guard Nate Davis. And then tackle-wise, lost Dennis Daly, LaRaven Clark, and then obviously the big one, Taylor Lewan. He retired. And then wide receiver Robert Woods, they also lost, and tight end Austin Hooper. And on the defensive side of the ball, lost a couple of key linebackers in David Long and Zach Cunningham. And then also lost edge rusher Bud Dupree, who they had signed a couple years ago, but just never really got healthy, it seemed. And then defensive end Deshaun Hand as well, and also cornerback Terrence Mitchell. And then addition-wise, they did recently bring in wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins, also brought in tight end Geoff Swaim, and tackle Andre Dillard from the Eagles, former first-round pick. Also offensive lineman Daniel Brunskill from the Niners, who's been a starting lineman for them for a bit. And then also grabbed linebacker Aziz Al-Shair and cornerback Sean Murphy-Bunting. And then draft-wise, addressed offensive line and grabbing offensive lineman Peter Skoronski in round 1, pick 11. And then they did grab Will Levis, one of the biggest kind of surprises of the draft, in round 2, pick 33. Unfortunately, Levis seems like he'll be QB3, especially with the recent injury he sustained going to the season. And then also running back Tyjae Spears out of Tulane, they grabbed around 3, and he's been producing this preseason as well. But anyway, like I mentioned, these Titans, they're always in the mix or somehow outperform, the record's better than many feel they are. They're kind of a scrappy, variable team. What are your thoughts on them going into the season, John?
I'll start with the defense. I am interested by the defensive unit. First off, they're getting Harold Landry back from injury. He didn't get to play last year because I can't remember what the injury was specifically, but maybe it was ACL or something like that.
I wanted to say that, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, don't quote me on that, but I know that he missed the whole season. And so you get him back, and that's pretty huge because obviously you have Jeffrey Simmons, who can cause a lot of chaos on the line of scrimmage, but you add a guy like Harold Landry, who the last time we saw him, he got 12 sacks. So he was looking to be like he was ascending into being one of those premier pass rushers. And then, he got paid, he got his big extension, and then he gets hurt. And so it's going to be nice to see him fully back. I'm also very interested in their secondary. Obviously, Kevin Byard is the rock of that secondary. Armani Hooker had a pretty solid season last year. But then the corners, specifically with Christian Fulton, Sean Murphy-Bunting, Caleb Farley, Roger McCreary, a very interesting unit. I think there's a lot of potential here. A lot of guys who could, it feels like all 4 of those guys are kind of at a phase in their career where, they could take that next step any given moment, or this could just be who they are. I'm not sure. But I don't know. I think that just makes for a really interesting cornerback room, and I certainly think that all 4 of those guys are relatively solid. So that one's going to be a fun one to watch as well. But on offense, things get a little weird. Derrick Henry obviously, has dealt with injuries, and so that's why I'm not surprised they go out and get Tyjae Spears to, add some depth there. Because Derrick Henry is really the lifeblood of this offense. I think that on paper, adding DeAndre Hopkins was a good move. Because ever since you got rid of A.J. Brown, like Treylon Burks, he had moments where he flashed last year, but he didn't show that he was necessarily going to instantly be your wide receiver 1. So I think that Hopkins can kind of help smooth that transition over a little bit, and I'm still a Treylon Burks believer. And then for Tannehill, I'm interested to just see how they do if Tannehill can stay healthy this year, because what I will say about the Titans is I don't think their season last year was actually as bad as some people might think it was. Now, there were some games that were pretty brutal, like early on, I think it was week 2 when they got blown out by Buffalo, but they were a scrappy team. I mean, we talk about the Vikings and how the Vikings won 11 one-score games. I mean, just going through the Titans' schedule last year, week 1, they lose by 1. Week 3, they win by 2. Week 4, They win by 7. Week 5, they win by 4. Then they win by 9. Then they win by 7. Then they lose by 3. Then they win by 7. So like they were also in a lot of tight games, and specifically some of their losses. I wanted to bring up Tannehill because he missed 5 games last season, and those 5 games were he did not play against the Texans the first time that they played them, and they did win that game by 7 points. Then they played the Chiefs the next week, and once again, this is Malik Willis in his rookie year. He completed 5 passes in that game, and yet they only lost by 3 in overtime. So with Tannehill in that game, I think he completes more than 5 passes. I mean, come on. So they could have potentially beaten the Chiefs that week. Then later on, Tannehill comes back after that. When he comes back, they win 2 games in a row. They then lose to the Bengals and then the Eagles. Then they lose to the Jaguars. We fast forward. Tannehill gets hurt again. He misses the final 3 games of the year, which are against the Texans, where they lose by 5, the Cowboys, where they lose by 14, and then the Jaguars, where they lose by 4. So they went 1-4 when Tannehill was not healthy. And I think that, like I said, some of those games could have, just looking at the scores, they lose to the Chiefs by 3. They lose to the Texans by 5. They lose to the Jaguars by 4. I think that Tannehill is good enough, and Malik Willis, quite honestly, last year, and I think even at the last 2 games, it was actually Josh Dobbs. It wasn't even Malik Willis.
Yeah, off the street, by the way.
Yeah.
Like they signed him and started him days later.
Yeah, like I think that Tannehill could have made certainly a difference in that game. I mean, even for example, that game they lose to the Texans. This is the Texans' second ever win, which I think was what gave the Panthers the number 1 overall pick. But anyway,
or the Bears, because the Bears.
Or sorry, the Bears. Yeah, the Bears. Because you're correct. They traded for it. Anyway, the Texans win this game against the Titans. Malik Willis had 99 total passing yards, and he threw for 2 interceptions. This is a game where Derrick Henry had 126 rushing yards and a touchdown. You're telling me that Tannehill, at the very least, even if he had a rough day throwing, wouldn't thrown at least 1 of less interception and at least 50 more yards? Like, I think that Tannehill could have done enough to get them maybe another touchdown in that game. Like I said, with the Chiefs, they lose by 3. That Jaguars game, the final week of the season, that was a win or go home game, I believe. I think if they won that game, they might have made the playoffs. Am I wrong on
Jags?
that?
I think they would have controlled their own destiny going into the last week if they beat the Jags.
I think the Jags was the last week. Was the Jags was the last week?
Okay, I think there was some crazy scenario where I think they would have gotten in. I remember something like that.
If they beat them, they would have been tied, and I don't know what the full tiebreakers were because we talked about it last year. But I think there was some scenario in the last couple weeks where they could have made it. And point being, in that game, Josh Dobbs, he throws for 179 yards. He does throw for a touchdown and 1 interception. Once again, a game where Derrick Henry gets over 100 on the ground. I feel like, and that defensive performance from the Titans that game was amazing, too. They held Travis Etienne to only 17 total yards. Lawrence only had 200 yards and a touchdown. So it feels like, in general, if Tannehill's healthy last year for the whole year, maybe 2 or 3 of those results go differently. And we could be talking about the Titans being the division winner. The reason I say all that is I don't want to count out the Titans just yet. I think that a lot of people already are because it feels like the Jaguars are ascending, and I certainly think that they deserve to be the favorite to win the division. But like you mentioned at the top of this section, the Titans cannot be ignored. They're a feisty team. I wouldn't be shocked if they were to go out there and, maybe beat the Jaguars early on and really punch them in the mouth. And at the end of the year, maybe it's tight again like it was last season. So offensively, I'm sure you're going to talk about this too. I am a little bit worried about the offensive line because historically over the Vrabel era, the offensive line has been really strong. And as of right now, it's not looking like a strength.
Yeah. Do you have the depth chart? Because I was wondering where they're putting Peter Skoronski. Is he? And I haven't been watching much preseason. Titans preseason.
I'll read the whole offensive line. Left tackle is going to be Andre Dillard. Left guard is going to be Skoronski. Then center is Aaron Brewer. Right guard is Daniel Brunskill, like you said, from the Niners. And then right tackle is Nicholas Petit Ferreira, I think is how you pronounce it.
Okay. So definitely some new faces / guys that maybe they've been developing or waiting, or nonetheless, not a lot of experience across that group, especially starting. Because I know I mentioned Dillard. I know he's a former first round pick, but it was a little like Philly obviously was fine letting him go, and they've kind of already found a guy in Mailata, who was really good. So I'm not sure if that was just more fortunate that, okay, they felt that Mailata was just way much better than Dillard. But nonetheless, some question marks on that O-line.
Also, correction, Nicholas Petit, however you say his name, he was a third-round pick last year. He actually got suspended for 6 games due to gambling. So, Chris Hubbard will be the right tackle to start the season.
Okay, so dicey. It's going to fall kind of like on what I mentioned a little bit with the Jaguars, where I guess we'll see. I'll be interested to see. They're probably going to ride Henry early in the season, I would assume. Now, granted, they do have Tannehill, like you mentioned, and like you've already alluded to, like, we know it's kind of almost like with the Kirk Cousins discussion. Like, yes, Ryan Tannehill may not be a superstar quarterback, but just having that stability at that position, like, you can't. Last year showed you can't take that for granted. He does for the most part take care of the ball, and I know there's the one Bengals game where it all went bad in the playoffs. So yes, it was one game, but nonetheless, I wouldn't be shocked if in this stacked AFC division they somehow sneak in, like you mentioned, because they do get Harold Landry. I did confirm coming back from ACL. And we already mentioned last podcast about how great Jeffrey Simmons is on the inside for them. And you mentioned they're young but very talented corner room. Like Roger McCreary had some good moments last year. And Caleb Farley, a guy who I was high on, still a first-round pick, really health, I feel like, has gone in his way. And hopefully everything's fine with him in regards to the recent news about his house blowing up. And then Fulton's been really solid for them as well. And then you mentioned their safeties, of course. It will be interesting if they can replicate the production of losing David Long, because he was really good for them. But it wouldn't shock me because it's Mike Vrabel coming from New England, and Mike Vrabel's a former linebacker himself. So it's just one of those things where I'm going to assume that Vrabel is going to coach the next guy up, maybe have someone fill in that spot for him really well. So
and we can't forget, I mean, this was a team that last year we were talking about the Titans. Once the injuries started happening, all this stuff, we were like, oh, they're kind of done for. And I can't remember which. I'm going to try and pull their schedule back up, because there was one specific, I think it was the Rams game. Do you remember that game where we were talking about the Titans like, oh, they're kind of done for. This is going to be a rough year for them. And then defensively, they were just
they flipped the switch like because you mentioned they got blown out like with week 2 or 3. Like Vrabel has that same similar kind of Belichickian thing where like they may get blown out or really have a surprise, just terrible performance the first months of the year, and then as the year goes on, their defense seems to get better and better. As time goes on, like they tighten things up in their rules.
Yeah. It was actually 2 years ago. They won 28-16. Tannehill only had 143 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Donta Foreman with 29 rushing yards.
Oh, yeah.
So you can see the offense was not moving the ball at all, and yet they won the game 28-16 because they picked off Stafford twice, and I think 2 of those were pick sixes. So, that was a year too where the Titans were dealing with a lot of injuries in that game. Like it just
Derrick Henry was, I think, probably, I'm guessing, assuming out before that game. So that's probably why we were like, oh, they're cooked, because
Derrick Henry was out. Like, I mean, they did have AJ Brown, but he only had 42 total receiving yards because the defense knew that he was like the guy to watch. And so, it was. I don't know. Anyway, I just bring that up to say like the Titans are always scrappy. Like even if we don't know necessarily some of these names and stuff like you said about Vrabel, we can't count them out.
And this last thing I want to go to is switch back to the offense is just going to be wide receiver. And because we saw there was an issue last year, not a lot of, on top of all the other issues, the quarterback issue, the offensive line, you saw the missing of AJ Brown, where at least he would have a couple of splash plays. And once again, like we mentioned last year, it's no offense to Treylon Burks. He's put in a tough spot, and he was already dealing with injuries and such last year going to the season, already kind of dealing with it this year. So you understand, like John mentioned, bringing in Hopkins, just reliable one, or hey, at least you have 2 reliable guys finally on the outside. And then Chigi Okonkwo had some moments for them last year at tight end, so maybe he can take the next step too and be more involved in the passing game. But like you mentioned, do not sleep on the Titans.